So welcome everyone, and first of all I want to thank the Institute for Politics and Society for hosting this conference again and for having me as a moderator again, which I feel is a great honor. Some of you mentioned during the lunch break and the coffee breaks that you were looking forward to this panel about security and defense, and we feel honored that you've stayed for the whole day. You've been looking forward to this, and we take this as a motivation to make it as structured, entertaining, and insightful as I hope as possible. During this conference so far we've been discussing all the challenges that are mostly coming from inside the European Union, such as finances, institutions, and so on. Now we would like to turn our attention to the external challenges to our union, which is mostly security and defense issues. And as the subtitle of this panel is hybrid threats, our attention is mostly towards the east, which means Russia. And if we say Europe, I deliberately mean Europe and not the European Union, because we do have also Ukrainians on this panel, so it makes a whole lot of sense not to restrict ourselves to the European Union member states only, but to the whole of Europe. In your conference leaflets you find a definition of hybrid warfare, and to make it very, very brief, hybrid warfare means to extend warfare beyond the deployment of mechanical, conventional, physical means to economic, financial, social disinformation means. Russia did not invent hybrid warfare, but Russia is very well known for having deployed those means impressively on Ukraine and very probably also currently on other states in Europe. So this will be the main focus of this panel, and I would like to go along a red line which goes a bit like this. I would like to know from all our panelists, how do you actually perceive the hybrid threat that is currently posed to Europe? How do you evaluate the responses that the member states as well as the EU show towards that threat? And ideally, I would wish for, as an outcome of this debate, I would wish for some responses to the question, how can we as Europeans do better at responding to hybrid threats? In juggling, it says juggling 5 balls instead of 4 is twice as difficult, requires more brain capacity. I guess talking to 5 panelists is a bit the same. It will be challenging for me as a moderator, it will be challenging for you as well. I might need your help, and I would like to invite you to get involved with your questions and to pick up the balls that our panelists are throwing into the air and throw them back to us. I'll make sure we have enough time for that. Let me introduce you the panelists that we have today from the right to the left. To my far right, I would like to introduce to you Vladislav Davidson. He is the chief editor of the Odessa Review, a literature critique for the tabloid magazine. And important to say in this case, he's half Russian, half American, living in Ukraine, in times when Vladimir Putin rides an orange truck over the newly built Crimea Bridge. He might be one of the most interesting people to talk to. Welcome, Vladislav. Next, from the right-hand side, Bruno Lete, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Bruno is mostly working on security and defense issues. I think one might say you are a frequent traveler in Mid and Eastern Europe, and you have a pretty good overview over security and defense, hybrid warfare efforts being taken at NATO and at individual member states, and we're looking forward to hear more from you on that. In the center, Dimitri Teperek. He is the chief executive of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia. And very interestingly, Dimitri doesn't only work on hybrid warfare, he also led or is still leading an initiative where in Estonia the government tries to animate young Russian-speaking people to get involved in Estonian defense initiatives. So that is a social cohesion project, and we're curious to learn more about that from you. Then I would like to introduce to you Janusz Oniszkiewski. I think if someone personates European history of the past 40 years, it might very well be you, having been active and a core member of the Solidarność movement in Poland, brought about freedom and change in Poland, has then been active in the Polish government, serving as a defense minister twice in the Polish government, moved on to the European Parliament, has been the vice president of the European Parliament. Based on all this experience, Janusz, we're really curious to learn more from you, your perspective on hybrid warfare. To my right hand, I would like to introduce to you, last but not least, Yevhen Perebeinish, who is the Ukrainian ambassador to the Czech Republic. I think you previously served already as an ambassador to Latvia, to Sweden, and if I'm correctly informed, you were also a spokesperson of the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs during those turbulent years 2014 and 15. That's correct. And I think this is also a very interesting angle that you will be speaking from. Let's start this debate with you, Vladislav, who's currently living in Ukraine. As I said, last week Vladimir Putin drove that orange truck over this newly built bridge. Maybe you can give us an overview of how does the situation in Ukraine look like at the moment, and how do you look at the overall situation being half American, half Russian?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I imagined that His Excellency, Honorable Ambassador, would give the strategic aspect of the Ukrainian situation, and I would just go for tactics. But I guess I'll have to talk about the situation in wider stripes than I had intended to. So basically, we're a year exactly off from the elections, which are going to take place, the presidential elections followed by the parliamentary elections, which will take place in exactly 1 year, May 19th, and I think 2 months after that we'll have the parliamentary elections in Ukraine. So everything that's happening now on the level of on a particular level of politics in Kiev has to do with preparations for those elections, and that also I mean that means with everything that intimates in terms of maneuvering and political maneuvering and positioning, and also everything that conversely intimates in terms of influence operations from the Russians on Ukraine and on Ukrainian civil society and politics, right? So you do have the opening of this bridge, long expected by the Russians. 5 days later, I think it's 4 or 5 days later, the bridge is now indefinitely closed for repair work. I don't think they finished the bridge. The famous, in fact, infamous engineering structural problems that have to do with building a bridge of that size and that length over such a very difficult piece of geography, and over a body of water that is so deep and has a bottom that is so rocky and so sandy. Those famous logistical issues do not seem to have been conquered by the Russians and the Russian engineers at press time. So after President Putin drove that truck, I think no one else did. They closed it immediately for repair work. But that bridge is indicative of Russian operations and Russian structural movement to continue trying to integrate Crimea into the Russian Federation. Crimea has, of course, been annexed, and I don't know if non-experts know this, but Crimea's status as an independent republic, which it had for, I think, the first 2 or 3 years after it was annexed, which had kept over from Ukrainian, it is occupied Ukrainian territory, but it had the status of an independent entity within Ukrainian constitution, and it had a similar status when it was first annexed. But since then, partly to make giving it back much more difficult, the Russians have taken away its independent structural and legal characteristics. So it's now it's now been folded over into the closest region and into regional military operational whatever the mechanism is. So it had its own military operation. I mean, it's being militarized very quickly now, but before that, it was an independent military theater. Now it's part of a wider military theater of that sector of the Russian army. I guess that's just broad strokes, but I mean, elections are starting, the war continues, Ukrainian men get shot and killed, and young women also on the contact line every day. Ukrainians are muddling through their heroes. They still hate their political class. I guess you know all these things. But Sebastian?
Thank you, Ladislav, for this first overview of the situation in Ukraine. We will see how that measures the larger pattern, the situation that we will get right now. Bruno, maybe you can share your take on the current hybrid threat with us, and maybe you can also draw a bit on the question what countries, in your opinion, are currently affected by hybrid warfare, and which of them are actually aware of that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And being based in Brussels, nobody's perfect. Let me perhaps also talk a little bit about EU and NATO angle as well. So, to kickstart, let me perhaps say that what we see in Europe, let's put this in perspective, because hybrid warfare is on the rise in many different corners of the world. It's not just happening here in Europe. It's the tactics of hybrid warfare are being used globally nowadays. It's a trend that's being pushed by Russia, by China, but we also see smaller regional players like Iran, North Korea that are using hybrid warfare techniques, but also non-state actors. Think about what ISIS did in Western Europe, or what Boko Haram is doing in Africa. So I think it's really important to realize that we're not alone on this boat in Europe. We see the same problems in many different corners of the planet. But here in Europe, it seems to me that we're still struggling a little bit to formulate a response to hybrid warfare activities. I think the main problem is that we Europeans perhaps still think about hybrid warfare as an abstract concept, whereas our opponents, adversaries, are very practical about it. They're very operational. They just do hybrid warfare. Whereas in Europe, hybrid warfare has been a favorite study field of think tanks and universities, but governments and institutions have only started at earnest to deal with the issue. The EU and NATO, for instance, have created their hybrid warfare strategy in 2015 only, I think. And since then, there's also a variety of centers of excellence and centers of expertise that have been established. Think, for instance, about the center in Helsinki or the NATO Southern Hub in Naples. These are examples. But when it comes to these centers, just zooming in a little bit, we often see that even for themselves, they have a difficulty to fill in their own purpose and objectives. Their mandates, their methods are often ambiguous. They've been imposed serious restrictions when it comes to collecting and sharing sensitive information. And in some cases, some of these centers are simply underfinanced and understaffed, which makes it really hard for them to make an impact on policy making or decision making. So in a nutshell, to answer your question, Sebastian, I think Europe's response to hybrid warfare is still very limited in scope. There's a mismanagement of expectations, and there's a lack of resources. And in many cases, we've been creating a bureaucratic response to a non-bureaucratic issue. So, we can do better, and moving forward, I think we need to carefully think about our next steps. I'm happy to dig a bit deeper in those next steps later on if there's still time, but let me finish here in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for this first overview. And let me turn to Dimitri. you are based in Tallinn, in Estonia, a country that is living on the border to Russia and that has been very shocked, or among those countries who have been most shocked by the events in Ukraine. How do you look at the current threat situation? How has it evolved in the last, let's say, 3 years or so?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Well, I would say that the first shock actually came not after the war in Ukraine, but actually the war in Georgia. But then nobody listened to the Baltic states in Poland, unfortunately. But last year's provided us in the Baltics actually a better understanding of the processes, how the threats originated or created by Russia are changing over time. And I want to elaborate here on conventional military threats, which, by the way, and actually are existential threat to our countries, but I rather would focus on hostile influence we are witnessing almost every day. Is it true that we became more professional in monitoring those threats? So we know where and how they are originated and created. We are now smarter in comprehending the hostile essence of those threats. Well, I wish I could say the same for the effective countermeasures, but this is not the case in many countries. But on the other hand, Russia continues to invest a lot of resources into pushing the evolution of its toolbox. And Russia has, as you know, actually a long history of doing that, and they became really masters of disinformation, active measures and manipulation. And I think our collective mistake in the West was that we underestimate it. But now, the regime in Kremlin, of course, is very opportunistic in exploiting our weaknesses and in applying its hybrid toolbox. At the same time, there is no doubt that Kremlin's actions always have been and will be carefully prepared, designed to evolutionate from hostile to harmful, and therefore might have long-term effect on our societies. So the key target of them is to create changes in societal behavior. This is not just propaganda. They really aim at societal behavior. And the war in Ukraine actually proves that very much. So I would like to emphasize shortly the following cognitive vectors of recent Kremlin activities in the Baltics. So first of all, very shortly, Russia is imposing false and prefabricated historical perceptions and spreading toxic narratives among targeted societies. Russia does it by declaring moral monopoly and ensuring informational supremacy on such topics as World War II, Second World War, USSR and post-Soviet Russia. So it tries to cover all the spectrum of issues, from personal values and mindset of populations to history textbooks and war monuments. Second one, Russia is going even more digital, and Russia, what it does, it reinforces mutually offline events with online campaigns, as we know. And this targets, first of all, our younger generation who consume information mainly from social media, including some Russian-controlled networks. Well, Ukraine banned social media, Russian-made social media networks. We didn't. And what we observe, what we monitor, that cyber and digital tools are very much in use by Russia and its proxies in the Baltics. And as a response, actually, we mobilized our civil society, especially focused on Russian-speaking young generation, that they could help us to monitor social media networks, how the toxic narratives are spread, who are so-called opinion leaders on those networks, which are the toxic groups where hostile narratives are originated. So basically we are trying to involve Russian-speaking youth in Estonia, partially in Latvia, into countering or defending the cognitive space online of our countries. And the third one, and this is I think the most dangerous, that Russia is doing or started to do a better social psychological profiling of targeted groups, especially opinion leaders and active citizens whose vulnerabilities are often exposed and over-discussed in public media by pro-Kremlin agents and maybe just useful idiots. So basically what they do, they label pro-Western, pro-NATO activist politicians, journalists as being highly Russophobic. So they try to manipulate with them. So we detected actually several offline and online interconnected groups of Kremlin sympathizers in the Baltics, and their actions, believe me, are very much coordinated. So they know really much the social psychological profile of the target groups. So that's, in short, the situation looking from my perspective in Estonia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. I would like to come back to you soon and then dig a bit deeper on the question of how successful you've been with those projects and if they can serve as a role model for other nations that want to build up resilience against hybrid threats. Janusz Oniszewski, with all the experience that you bring in from all the functions you had, and you've not only seen history pass by, you've also shaped it. How dramatic do you see the current situation? How much of a threat do we actually face in Europe, and how do you see Russian-European relations evolve in, let's say, the next 10 years?
Well, some of you may know that I'm a mathematician. Every mathematical debate begins with definitions. So it would be probably good to realize that there is no good, generally accepted definition of what hybrid warfare is. And the reason why there is such a difficulty is that hybrid warfare cannot be defined simply by listing some sort of methods or practices which are used. Because all these practices which are characteristic for hybrid warfare are known for centuries. After all, even in antiquity and also in Middle Ages, terror was a fairly common practice. You were simply killing every inhabitant of a city which simply defended itself just to show the others that they shouldn't do it. Finally, Spaniards managed to conquer Mexico and South America, playing on differences between various tribes, Indian tribes. And even the last sort of method, which is total destabilization of a country, which is also an element of hybrid warfare inventory, was practiced by Germans who were simply during the First World War, who sent Lenin to Russia to destabilize completely Russia, and that way won the war with Russia. So what really makes the difference? Why now we talk about hybrid warfare as something different than what we know from the past? The difference is, first, because it has already been more or less somehow solidified in a very clear concept, and also the preponderance of these measures over purely military measures. And I obviously refer to quite well-known so-called Gerasimov doctrine. According to this doctrine, which has been revealed, it was not a sort of a surprise, it was rather well known, but he sort of summarized everything which was already considered to be a practice of Russian general staff. In his doctrine, he simply declared that the future war will be entirely different. First, there will be no basically sort of a clear distinction between peacetime and all-out war. It could sort of gradually drift towards the all-out war by using all sorts of other measures, like, first of all, disinformation, like undermining the trust of the local population within their own system and in their own authorities, like playing on differences between different minorities or even political differences in the country. And he claimed that basically, applying these methods, you can destabilize almost every country to such an extent that everybody would sort of more or less accept sort of final military inclusion as something, I would say, natural, and even in order to secure some kind of order. So this is the whole thing. For the centuries, the main concept, military concept, was to bring the will of resistance by defeating the opponent's army. That was the concept which was so well developed by Clausewitz, but also by the others. Now, the main problem is not to sort of break the will of resistance by defeating the army. Is by total destruction of the social and political system. This is something which is happening. And this was, as I said, already enshrined in something which is called the Gerasimov doctrine. So the moment in which the military come into the picture is at the very last stage, and it is rather insignificant. Gerasimov claimed that the main clashes, military clashes, are something of the past. That will not happen in hybrid war if the hybrid war is properly sort of performed. So, what is the problem now? Now the problem is that we might be at this first stage of this process. The first stage because we are the target of disinformation activities from Russia. And also in the Russian efforts to destabilize the internal political situation, or at least create a situation in which some destabilizing elements would really take over. In Polish case, we have a rather clear situation. Clearly, obviously, Russia cannot sort of play on creating pro-Russian sentiments. This would be non-starter. But what Russia can play on is raising, for example, problems with Ukrainians, raising some sentiments resulting from our very difficult, sometimes very good, sometimes very difficult past. This obviously is not addressed to the ruling party. It is addressed to rather marginal, but still fairly vocal groups, fairly radical groups, which raise this issue. And the problem is that our leading party, Law and Justice Party, simply wants to avoid the situation which we can see in Hungary, that there is something more to the right than the leading party. They want to create a situation on which to the right of the Law and Justice Party will be only war. That's why they simply try to accommodate, to appease, to somehow bring into the whole political sort of embrace also very radical right-wing parties. And that's why they can tolerate, these very anti-Ukrainian actions and activities. And this is something extremely, extremely dangerous. So what can we do, generally speaking? Well, I think that with this concept of hybrid warfare, what really is extremely important is not only to build some military capabilities, but first of all to build certain resilience of political system and resilience of the society, and also awareness on disinformation. Because what very often is referred to as the information war is not an information war, it's a disinformation war. And the ability to somehow distinguish between fake news and real news is something which obviously should also be an element of education in school and also public education. But nevertheless, we must be quite aware of the fact that Russia, because Russia cannot sort of increase their own capacities and their own sort of standing to be on par or even to be in a stronger position towards the United States or European Union. What Russia is trying to do is not to raise their own capabilities, but to diminish the capabilities of the others, first of all of European Union and also of the United States, promoting these political groups and tendencies which are disruptive to European unity and to the cohesion of the states, which is quite clearly seen in Germany with Russian support of AFD. Thanks.
Thank you, You still have 15 minutes until you have to catch your plane. I hope you still have time to get back to you for one more question. But for now, I would like to turn to His Excellency Yevhen Pelbenish, representing a country that's largely being affected by hybrid warfare, Ukraine. Please give us an overview. How do you look at the situation and the threat posed to Ukraine and to Europe? What are the messages that you are communicating to your European partners?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, Ukraine, having had a very sad experience of Russian aggression, has definitely a lot to say about the topic of our panel. Since our time is limited, I will refrain from telling you long stories about the world and Europe facing multi-vectoral challenges, one of which is propaganda, cyber attacks, and so on. It seems to me that we have to call a spade, and therefore I have to tell you the truth, which you are already aware of, most of you. I think we are at war. And I mean not only Ukraine, we, Europe, and all civilized world are at war, and our enemy is Russia. The sooner we understand this, the sooner we will find a way to win this war. Russia is at different stages of war against each of us. When it comes to Ukraine, this is not simply a hybrid war. It is the hybrid war with some elements of conventional war. Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine began many decades, even centuries ago. And military aggression against Ukraine is just the last stage of the Russian hybrid strategy in Ukraine. Because capturing Ukraine has always been a priority for Russia, since no Russian empire is possible without Ukrainian lands. And they understand it very well. Another question is why Russia is applying its hybrid strategy now. And the answer is very simple, because Russia is not able to compete with the West in the usual way, by creating an attractive political, economic, and cultural model. Alternative, yes, and model. In fact, Russia, without oil, gas, and nuclear, as well as nuclear weapon, is a rather backward country. However, with huge ambitions, not compatible with its real capabilities. That's why Kremlin wants to be the third Rome, the center of integration processes. However, no one wants to join these integration unions. Therefore, in order to integrate those states, which, in Moscow's opinion, belong to its sphere of influence, they apply its hybrid methods of influence. So Ukraine was the first to be attacked by Moscow, but not the last one. No doubt Europe is the next target of Russia. It might take, of course, some time until Russia is ready, until the ground in Europe is ready for military attack. However, that does not mean that Europeans can calm down and continue to live their normal, ordinary lives. No, just the opposite. Russia's hybrid war against Europe is already underway, and if you take, for example, thousands of Russian or pro-Russian trolls have been infecting brains of Europeans or even here in the Czech Republic with ideas of bad European Union, bad NATO. It's not simply plurality of opinions. This is a special information operation. When dozens of pro-Russian propaganda sites in the EU and again in the Czech Republic throw in the fake news in the information space, it's not just freedom of speech. This is an informational warfare. When the Russian military band, so-called Alexandrovцы, arrives here, it is not a Russian culture at all. This is a diversion against European values in order to disorient and demoralize the Czech society. When Russian bikers, these so-called night wolves, come here, or actions like immortal regiment have been held, surely it's not in order to honor the memory of victims of the World War II. This is a kind of moral pressure on the Czech society, modeling the occupation, if you want, or occupation of several European cities by Russian citizens, control of by Russian business over the certain economy, spheres of economy, and I mean not only the Czech Republic. We can easily find many of such examples around the Europe. Also, Karlovy Vary is one of the brightest cases. All these things are extremely dangerous, being elements of a hybrid war. This is a preparation of the ground. Then, when the ground is ready, a military aggression will surely come. Believe me, as a representative of the country which has passed through all of this. Russia, having established a complete dictatorship at home, efficiently uses democratic instruments of Western societies for its aggressive purposes. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of business. So, if we recognize that we are at war, we cannot allow the enemy freely to use hybrid weapons of our territory. For example, you are not allowing Russians to apply conventional weapons against Europeans, rockets, cannons, tanks. If they try to do this, they will get a rebuff. So why do you allow to use informational weapons against you, all sorts of Sputniks, Russia Today's, and so on and so forth? This is a true weapon, not media at all. From our perspective, and you mentioned that we prohibited all these Russian social networks and so on. So they should be immediately banned, like Russian tanks and missiles are banned. All sorts of night wolves and so on should be banned. Resistance to Russian cyber attacks and fighting against Russian influence in elections must be systematically underway. And in case in any case, we cannot go forward without two things. A need to recognize the fact that we are at war and that war is going on against us, and a need to restrict certain freedoms to those who use these freedoms in order to attack us, aiming at undermining our freedoms. So that's...
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So thanks to all of you for giving a first overview of what hybrid warfare looks like at the moment. I've seen quite a lot of agreement, and I think there's a big focus on disinformation as a main mean of warfare. It's not only affecting Ukraine, but also other countries. Janusz Onyszkiewicz will have to leave us in 5 minutes, but this allows me to give him a last question. During the last panel, when you were still sitting in the audience, you asked a question, and you said PESCO was just a decoration. So I understand you would wish for more. And so with regards also to disinformation warfare and hybrid warfare, how would PESCO look like if you were to draft it?
Well, first of all, according to the Lisbon Treaty, PESCO is not with capital letters, indicating that this is one institution. It is kind of a framework. There could be many PESCOs, and I do hope that there will be another one. Because after all, what was the idea behind this permanent structured cooperation? Because that's what PESCO is really about, was to allow countries which are ready for higher levels of cooperation in military area and for more, I would say, more further going commitments to this cooperation. And this was the essence. If you have a PESCO system which embraces practically everybody inside the European Union, then you have only another framework for forming common security and defense policy, CSDP. That there is no way that countries which are all members of PESCO are really ready to commit themselves to more ambitious tasks and to commit themselves to more, I would say, greater readiness to use the force, to use force. That's why I think there will be probably another PESCO, and it really, European defense really requires certain changes. Because after all, well, let me give you only one example. The peace dividend and reorientation towards missions outside the area of NATO resulted in a situation in which in countries like United Kingdom, France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, all together, there are less tanks than in Kaliningrad region only. We have more or less the same amount of tanks that all these countries put together. So, obviously, one need not to be absolutely alarmed. But, in Polish we have to say, opportunity makes a thief. If there will be a feeling on the side of Russia that these countries are very vulnerable, so they probably will try to use this advantage. And after all, I think that great Prussian king said once that diplomacy without military capability behind is like playing music without instruments. So, obviously we must not be obsessed with sort of immediate Russian danger, but to create certain capability which will not allow Russians to miscalculate is something which I think is very important. Sorry, but I have to leave because I had to reschedule my flight back because my plane was cancelled. So I must leave earlier than I would like to. I wish you to continue this discussion, and I would like first of all thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
On behalf of everyone, thank you so much for attending, for debating with us. Have a good day. So, we've now already heard, I'd like to draw a bit more on our responses to hybrid threats. And we've heard on the one hand about measures to increase our resilience. That's what Dimitri mainly talked about. And we've also heard about proposals to not even let the propaganda come in. That's what the ambassador proposed, saying that disinformation is just the same as tanks and should also be treated as such. Bruno, you're a close cooperation partner with GMF, with NATO. You're also close to CSDP and to the EU. Looking at those two general tactics or strategies, where would you see the response of the EU and NATO, and why?
Well, thank you very much for this question. I actually like to think about solutions. It's my preferred side of the equation, and I got two for you. As I said in my initial introduction, I do believe that we Europeans think too much about hybrid warfare in an abstract way. We are spending so much energy thinking about doctrine, analytics, trying to understand what hybrid warfare is, that we're actually forgetting to respond. Now, I don't want to dismiss the value of analysis. It helps our policy making, but we also need to become more operational and practical. The way to do so, in my opinion, is that a first step could be to focus on what I call the element of deniability of hybrid warfare. What I mean with that is that we still make it very easy for our opponents to deny that they have operations in our society. We make it very easy for them to operate in the gray zone that falls short of being an act of aggression, but still does a great job at destabilizing our societies. Now, how to address this? I think that perhaps we ought to think about mechanisms, maybe a method, maybe an entity, maybe an organism, like a concrete organism, perhaps at EU or NATO level, I don't know, that could monitor and attribute hybrid attacks and communicate about activities in certain countries that can be labeled as hybrid attacks. And that communication is very important, not only towards elites, but really towards general audiences, which are often the #1 target of hybrid activities. So what I mean to say is that we need to become operational on raising awareness. Why? Because hybrid warfare succeeds in spheres of ambiguity, but it fails, hybrid warfare fails where the target audience is aware that it's being targeted, when it's aware that it's being influenced. So that's very important. That's solution #1, or actually proposal #1. The second problem, I think, is collective response, or better said, the lack of collective response. Now, hybrid warfare is a phenomenon often without borders. It's cross-border. But we in Europe, we organize our response based on national response. I think that's very odd in certain cases. Now, the EU and NATO have a hybrid warfare strategy, but that strategy only allows them to have a coordinating role or an advisory role, and it clearly states that the primary responder is a national level. Now, I understand that governments may be hesitant to share sensitive information or to adjust their national priorities, but what is the impact of the current situation is that we're basically seeing a patchwork of responses based often on national interests that contradicts each other in the relationship to each other. A perfect example of this, a classic example, is Nord Stream 2. That project has split Europe in two camps. I mean, what a gift to Russia, right? So, I'm not saying that collective response will be easy. There are certain domains that it will be very hard. I think about energy policy, critical infrastructure, cyber. But there are other domains where we can still do better and where, it's perhaps easier to find a collective response. And collective response, it does not necessarily have to be 28 nations. It can be a coalition of the willing, some countries that share an interest. But these domains, for instance, can be disinformation and fake media. It can be tracking the illicit infiltration of organized crime in our societies. It can be monitoring the flow of money that is used to buy influence. There you really need collective response. At the national level, there's little you can do. So that would be my two proposals.
Thank you, Bruno. I'm sure we'll get back to that during the Q&A session. And Vladislav wanted to add to that.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think I agree with all those things, and those are important things to say, and we hear them often from our friends in the European Union, and those are the correct things that we'd like to hear from our partners within the European Union, right? But there's the question of solidarity, and there's a question of understanding the very particulars of the internationalist threat that is often used by Eastern Europeans for their own internal domestic consumption, politics, the Poles and the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, all who have substantial minorities within Ukraine. Ukraine is still a little Austro-Hungarian empire. And what happens is that very often, in this very moment, it's the Poles and the Hungarians who create problems, or to put it in a more delicate way, are not helpful enough to Ukrainians within European Union structures because of direct competition with the Ukrainians on a particular issue. So we discussed this yesterday in private, but now to return to it in public. The Hungarians have a problem with Ukraine, with a newly passed educational law. Ukraine has passed a new education law which makes the country much more normal. Little Ukrainians in southern Odessa region will not be educated in Bulgarian. I mean, obviously it's targeted at Russian speakers, but little Hungarians in Transcarpathia will not be educated in Hungarian. There are Slovak, Romanian minorities also who will not be educated anymore on the government dime in their own ethnic local languages. So Ukraine is that way becoming more normal, and this is a normative law that was passed. But the Hungarian government, along with the Poles and the Russians and the Turks, and I think two other governments who have substantial minorities within Ukraine, made a diplomatic fuss. Now the Poles did not go as far as the Hungarians, and the Hungarians are now at the point where Mr. Orban is threatening to have Mr. Poroshenko disinvited from the upcoming EU summit, right? Which would be a catastrophic signal to send to the Russians, right? So what the Russians are doing now in their disinformation campaigns, and it's extraordinarily sophisticated, this is the new innovation, is that they're using particular minorities within Ukraine to undermine the Ukrainians' own narrative. So I'll give you an example. A week ago, a Russian woman was arrested in Poland. She was some sort of agent, and she was, the Polish authorities did not release a lot of information about what she was doing, but she was playing some sort of games with Polish memory laws. This autumn, the SBU reported that Russian intelligence, SBU is Ukrainian Central Intelligence, Russian intelligence was using Polish neo-Nazi cell to create, I'm sure the ambassador will remember the situation, to create a terrorist campaign in Transcarpathia against a Hungarian cultural house, right? So what happened was that they brought in these Polish ultra-right wingers, and they, I think, either set a fire or graffitied up or broke the windows or caused property damage to a Hungarian cultural center on the Hungarian border, right? This was done to use minorities within Ukraine to be against Ukraine. In 2014 and 15, I'm from Odessa region, I have roots in the Odessa region, there's a lot of Bulgarians on the Romanian and Bulgarian border. There was a concerted Russian intelligence operation to create a Bulgarian People's National Republic, a separatist enclave, not unlike what they were doing on the other side of the country, but this was to get the Bulgarian Moldovan identity of the locals who don't have much particular connection with Kiev. Sometimes they're trying to get a political situation going. So that has been, in the Odessa case, that has been kind of, that situation has been kind of solved at the regional level and by good relationship between the SBU and Kiev and local Bulgarian elites, but this happens all the time. And the Europeans often fall for this stuff, and they should be more careful. The Hungarians and the Poles should be more mindful of their responsibility to the Ukrainians. Getting Mr. Poroshenko disinvited from an EU summit over a language law is, as our British friends would say, not helpful.
So very interesting. Both of you living in Brussels, living in Odessa, identify lack of cohesion in Europe as one of the main problems. Before I open the floor, I wanted to give Dimitri the opportunity to maybe elaborate briefly on how successful your project to integrate the Russian-speaking youth in Estonia into your anti-disinformation campaign actually was.
Well, it's still an ongoing project, or we called it a program actually, because project starts and it ends, but the program might run for a long time. Well, I can't answer it because how we measure the success. I think doing that is more important than not doing that. So basically, I don't know how the victory of this disinformation war could look like, because I think there will be no victory. So it's a new reality, it's still ongoing process. So therefore, we think that doing that is more important than not doing that. So the process, at least at this moment, is more important than the results, because we don't know how the results could look like. And I do believe in practical approach, and the speaker here, Bruno, actually listed the issues we could do, but actually we're already doing them in the Baltic states, at least in Estonia. And our approach is based on practicality and locality. So we don't share, I mean, of course, I'm truly a believer of transatlantic blah blah blah, but the problem is in our society. So therefore, the key issue is local answer. Well, it might be a little bit larger than local answer, it might be a regional one. So therefore, we cooperate closely with between the Baltic states. We learn a lot from Ukraine. We exchange experience with Poles and also with the Finnish and Swedish. But that still, it's very much regional. And our program is also based as so locality and flexibility. So if you involve a civil society, let's say pro-Estonian or pro-Western or pro-nature civil society, they're very much flexible in responding, in countering the Russian informational threat that the government institutions. Because government institutions are very much inflexible. They have to follow certain rules and diplomacy commissions, and then the question of attribution and whatever. Last week we just conducted a fourth time already, so that was a fourth time, a training event, Baltic Ukrainian training event for young professionals, equipping them with the very hands-on skills on countering Russian aggression, improving digital situation awareness, basically mapping all the hybrid attempts and attributing them. And they are just activists from civil society. So what we really need to do to produce more young professionals and to involve them on voluntary basis, because there are volunteers to do that, regardless of the language. And coming to my country back, of course, in Estonia we have at least 25% of population who are Russian speakers, and older generation is something you just cannot work with, understandably. But a younger one, I mean, they are our citizens, and we deny the monopoly of the Russian language. So Russia doesn't own the monopoly of Russian language. There are Russian-speaking Estonians. Full stop. Therefore, we involve them in our programs and voluntarily. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri, for elaborating a bit more on that. Ambassador, I know I owe you one more question, but if you agree, we'll pick one from the audience so that we have enough time to have some questions. You've been the first one, and you've been the second one. We'll, if you agree, we'll have both at a time and then distribute them.
Thank you very kindly. Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. As a historical footnote, I'd like to back up a little bit. My background is in strategic arms limitations and reductions many years ago, so it's a strategic issue. The development of strategic doctrine in Russia and the Soviet Union and much of the former Eastern Bloc is radically different from the way strategic doctrines are created in the West. In the West, we have a tendency to create new strategic doctrines based upon the current administration. However, if we go back and we look at, for example, the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which in fact is simply the result of someone's training in the system, actually we need to go back to Section 2 of the Yeltsin Doctrine. In Section 2 of the Yeltsin Doctrine, we find a complete map for what we would call now hybrid warfare, attacking the northern countries and the Baltics, for example, their banking systems, etc. What's important about the development of Soviet and Russian strategic doctrine and the development of what we now call hybrid warfare is that this is a continuation. Much as Czech law adapts itself in small pieces, the words and paragraphs are slightly changed instead of the Western technique of rewriting an entire law, so the Soviet and Russian strategic doctrines have been developed. It's a question of the basis of law. To return to what we're doing today, we basically see Ukraine as a testing ground for Russian hybrid warfare, and we've seen the same things in the attacks on power plants a couple of years ago. In 2002, in the United States House of Representatives, I spoke where I was predicting that we will see attacks on power plants and potentially water treatment plants in Europe and certainly in the United States. We have now had experts coming forward and saying, yes, in fact, there have been software seeds planted in various systems. And we know that the attacks in Ukraine have been real. So my question to our distinguished panel is, we now know that this is a global problem. Yes, there are other actors, but in fact, the Russian teams, and there are basically a handful of them, either directly proposed by the Russian government or indirectly funded or approved. This process is changing. How do we in the West need to change our response based upon our understanding that in fact the hybrid warfare operations in Ukraine are very much like the Spanish Civil War? And we all know who was testing their nose to equipment there. Thank you.
Okay, Philip.
Yeah, my wife is Ukrainian. She's a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, and her brother is a major in the Ukrainian military forces at the front line, defending Ukraine, and he is, of course, a Russian speaker. So I'm quite surprised by the language law, because it's not usual. A successful multi-language speaking state validates all the languages spoken in its borders. Certainly in the United Kingdom, we allow the Welsh language and support it through public funds. It doesn't provoke independence movements or schism. Surely, and I'm on Ukraine's side, surely this is a needless stripping away of Ukrainian loyalty from kind of your language groups that otherwise would probably support you. Why create this hostility? Or am I missing something? Am I getting something wrong with this? Because otherwise it seems like a needless playing into Russian hands.
Okay, as I promised, now you have a question. We start with yours.
May I ask you what kind of language law
Well, that's what I'd be interested in clarification.
Well, yes. Thank you. Thank you for your question. No doubt, Ukraine is Russian language is widely used in Ukraine, and you are right that many of Ukrainian soldiers fighting against Russia as a front are Russian speaking. It was one of the hybrid strategies of Russia when they used the language issue to occupy and Crimea and annexed actually the part of Ukrainian language. They said that Ukrainians, Banderovцы, are going to Crimea in order to kill everybody who speaks Russian. Of course, it's not true. Russian language is used all around Ukraine, even in the western part of Ukraine. You can come to Lviv, which is in the west, and which is mostly Ukrainian speaking, and freely use Russian language, and you'll be safe. The division of Ukrainians is not about language. It's about the attitude to Russian Putin's regime. And on the different sides of this division are different people. Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking people can be on the both sides. So this is an artificial issue created in Moscow. There is no language problem in Ukraine.
Can you explain the language law then? Because I remember hearing from the Hungarian ambassador, for instance, Knobsek, who was raging against this. So,
you get a microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. Can you explain what the language law is, and can you give an account of why there's been quite some protest against it?
You're probably talking about the education law, not language, because our language law is quite...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, I meant the education law.
So the education law, you can find towns and tens of towns and villages in the western part of Ukraine, particularly in the Transcarpathian region, where children do not speak, do not understand Ukrainian at all. Can you imagine in your country, for example, when children do not understand your state language? So the main purpose of the educational law is not to limit languages of the national minority, but to make circumstances in order to have possibility for all Ukrainian children, regardless of their nationality, to know to speak Ukrainian state language. So this is a problem, and unfortunately Hungarians are against it.
That seems perfectly fair, but do you publicly allow both? Do you allow both the indigenous minority language and the new teaching of Ukraine, or do you forbid the indigenous minority language?
No, not at all. We do not forbid minority languages. So they will be, the children will have the possibility to study, to learn these languages as it was before. But we want to increase the level of learning of our state Ukrainian language.
All right. I'm aware there's more questions, but we haven't responded to yours yet. whom of you would like to give that response?
Well, I appreciate your assessment of Russian hybrid warfare. You're right to say there's nothing new there. I think actually the very first Russian action of hybrid warfare was in 1923 against Estonia. It was called like a maskirovka, if I'm not mistaken. But exactly. So I think we need more continuation too. You're right to say that we don't have this at this point in Europe, and where can we find continuation? As I said, it's not the national level. The only platform that allows to have continuation is EU or NATO. Now, I can understand that perhaps some member states may not find this the most acceptable platform. I can understand that, but if not EU or NATO, as I suggested also, perhaps we ought to think about an independent organ. Perhaps something in nature like the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which played a major role in the Skripal investigation in London. So maybe we need an organization like that for hybrid warfare activities. Now the EU-NATO hybrid warfare center in Helsinki could be a platform, an existing platform that we could transform into something like that. But perhaps it is yet too early to already talk about that, but maybe in the future.
Okay, and we need a microphone for the two gentlemen here.
I want only to add to Philip Blond, because what I have heard in last days, that even Hungarian Prime Minister claimed about some issues on Ukraine, that in Ukraine it's not freedom of this speech, and it's not some complication with these minorities and with education of children in Hungarian language. So, if you can say more about this, or explain to Mr. Orban.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just continue on with what the ambassador said. So people do mix up the quote-unquote language law, which was 5029, which was passed in 2012, which allowed for, which was a kind of pre-election ploy to heat up the atmosphere before the election, before the 13 elections. There was a language law allowing the bypassing of the Ukrainian constitution, which only allows for one language. Ukraine has one language. It's not Switzerland, it's not Belgium. In some ways, Ukraine does not look unlike Belgium, but it is a country with one language. And when that, these are two different laws, the education law and the 2012 so-called Kolesnikov language law. That law was trying to bypass the Ukrainian consensus, constitutional consensus, for not using other other languages, minority languages within legal or administrative apparatuses, by allowing minority languages spoken by at least 10% of a given minority population to be spoken in administrative legal processes. So that was going to give Hungarian and Bulgarian and Crimean Tatar and Polish official status. This was an unconstitutional law. It was found to be unconstitutional in 2018 and thrown out. It was not contrary to Russian propaganda. It was not. Wasn't the first thing that the Maidan government did when they came to power was to ban Russia. No, I mean they threw acting President Turchynov threw that law up to the Ukrainian Constitutional Court to get rid of a political problem. And the Ukrainian Constitutional Court did what it was supposed to do, which is to find that law which was badly written and plainly unconstitutional to be unconstitutional. This educational law is something very different. And so there are perhaps legitimate criticisms of attempts at Ukrainization, but even for me, from a Russian-speaking family, I speak Russian to my wife and my mother, I find that criticism to be plainly ridiculous, in that people don't understand that, in England, as the ambassador told you, you do have lots of Polish children, but they're not taught Polish until the 8th grade and then only English in the 9th grade. with government money. If the Hungarian community wants to start their own Sunday schools and teach Hungarian to their kids after school or on Sunday, that is a normative thing. I'm from the Jewish community. We teach Hebrew to our children in the equivalent of Sunday school and after school. But it's not appropriate to criticize a country for making its citizens learn the language of which they need to apply to university. Hungarian Ukrainians now have no alternative but to apply to Hungarian universities when they're done with high school. I think that is not good for them to advance within Ukrainian society. I don't think that's good for brain drain from the country. While these criticisms of the Ukrainization have some credence, I think people need to understand what it is we're actually talking about. This is Ukraine normalizing itself and becoming a more normal country, right? If Ukrainians want to say we're going to rewrite the constitution, or we're going to have 2 languages or minority status for 3 or 4 languages, that's one thing. But this is a mechanism to normalize the country within the existing constitutional arrangements.
All right. I think you get your message across. Dimitri wanted to comment on that as well.
Yes, from the historian perspective, I'm actually very glad that Ukraine adopted the law, because we made a mistake in the early 90s, because that was very, and still is, a sensitive question issue. And today, in my country, we have one educational system, but 2 schools. One that's teaching in the Estonian language, the only constitution, the only state language, and another does in the Russian language. And we don't produce Russian language teachers at universities. Those children who finish Russian language school, then where they're supposed to go? To St. Petersburg, to Moscow, or I don't know. So they have still troubles to understand, to write, speak proper Estonian language. And believe me, I'm from a mixed family, I know what I'm talking about. So we made that mistake 20 plus years ago, and that was too sensitive for us to push this educational law that all the schools, all the education should be done in the national language. So Ukraine did it, and I mean, there is no question about it. It's a question of national security. So now, teachers from the Russian schools crossing the border and bringing, I don't know, history textbooks in Russian language to our schools for state money, for God's sake. Would you like to read a Russian textbook on history in the European Union?
All right. I'm very sorry. We've reached the end of the time of this debate, and I'm really sorry about that, because we've just started to develop a really interesting debate about how to actually achieve what we all agree about, that cohesion within societies, but also among partners in Europe, is probably the most important thing. And at the same time, it's what we're sadly lacking at many points regarding construction of Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which, being German myself, is a hotly debated topic in Germany, which I understand is a very disappointing development for many of our Central and Eastern European partners. The question of how to integrate your minorities in order to be more resilient against hybrid threats. So I want to thank you for this interesting debate and for highlighting those very important points, and I hope we can get together soon again to continue that debate. I would like to wrap this up by speaking out 2 invitations to you. The first invitation, if you like this debate, there's a chance to debate again very soon, organized by the Institut pro politiku a společnost, on whose behalf I would like to invite you to join them on the 30th of May, 5 o'clock in the evening. In the American Center of Prague, there will be a debate on the role of NATO in times of hybrid warfare. Very interesting as well, with different speakers than us. just check out the Institute for Politics and Society website for more information. Second information is also to you, and is for right now. Please join us for a glass of wine, one floor below this one, and so we can wrap up today's conference. Thank you very much.